Often when we're reading, we come across vocabulary that we haven't seen or heard before. One of the ways that proficient readers work these words out is to use context clues to try to figure out the word's meaning. So today we're going to focus on this vocabulary strategy, using context clues to determine meaning. In this video, I'm going to be using examples from Haruki Murakami's Super Frog Saves Tokyo, a short story about a frog who comes to a man and says that he needs his help in preventing an earthquake from destroying the city of Tokyo in Japan. Now, in the examples that I will refer to from the story, sometimes they'll be highlighted in yellow with some words underlined and in bold. Any of these words in bold and underlining are unfamiliar words or ones that might be challenging, and the yellow kind of is a bit of a clue as to where you should be looking for those context clues. Often when you come across these unknown words or phrases, you can look at neighbouring words and the sentences around these words for clues that will help you figure out what they mean. So in this example, our unknown word is imposing bulk. A skinny little man, no more than 5'3", Katagiri was overwhelmed by the frog's imposing bulk. So I would be looking at neighbouring words or words in the nearby sentences to help me figure out what imposing bulk means. It can be really helpful when you're applying a strategy to be aware of the different types of context clues that you might come across. There are 5 of them that we're going to look at today. Definitions, synonyms, antonyms, examples, and general clues that rely on a little bit more thinking. The first one is definitions. So a definition in a sentence or a neighbouring sentence, these are often signalled by words like is, are, is called, means, or they could be signalled by the verbs connecting the noun to a definition, or a pair of commas around a word or phrase. In Super Frog Saves Tokyo, this sentence appears. For many years I lived as a pacifist, loving art, living with nature. Fighting is not something I like to do. Using our context clues, we can see that after the unfamiliar word, we've got this pair of commas, loving art, living with nature. So we've got a little bit of a list happening. And then we've got another sentence that says fighting is not something I like to do. Using this, we could maybe have a guess that pacifist is something to do with not fighting or just enjoying sort of peacefulness. The second type of context clue is synonyms. So these are words with similar meanings to the unknown word, and they can often appear in the text quite close to the unknown word, but they can sometimes also appear a little bit further on. So early in Super Frog Saves Tokyo, we have this sentence: they would meet there late at night, and then later on, the character asks himself how much time had passed since then. Had the hours of his nighttime rendezvous with Frog gone by? Now this occurs a few paragraphs later, but if we'd been paying attention early in the story, we would have known that there was a meeting happening. And this unknown word, we could make a bit of a guess and say that this might be referring to that. Also based on the fact that it was happening late at night, and he refers to the lateness of the meeting down here. Our third type are antonyms. Now these are the opposite meaning of the unknown word. So these might be signalled by things like but, however, in contrast, on the other hand, though, unlike. And often they offer some kind of contrast with earlier information. So this sentence that we saw earlier, a skinny little man no more than 5'3", Katagiri was overwhelmed by the frog's imposing bulk. We have mention of Katagiri's height, him being a skinny little man, followed by him being overwhelmed by the frog's imposing bulk. Now, you don't need to know exactly what these mean, but this kind of movement from talking about Katagiri as small, we could make a little bit of a guess to say that maybe imposing bulk is about the size of the frog. Okay, and this would be based on the idea of opposites occurring kind of in a similar space. Our fourth one are examples. So these are when we see perhaps something with such as, for example, for instance, like, or including, or we might even have a colon to introduce a list. Okay, and here we're looking to use the different parts of the list to kind of help us figure out what the unknown word is. Our unknown word here is commuter system. The number of dead from such a quake would probably exceed 150,000, mostly from accidents involving the commuter system. Derailments, falling vehicles, crashes, the collapse of elevated expressways and railway lines, the crushing of subways, the explosion of tanker trucks. Now, if I don't know what a commuter system is, I'm going to look at this list and think, well, we've got vehicles, we've got crashing, we've got expressways, which are like freeways, we've got railway lines, subways, tanker trucks. So we've got a lot of like transport vehicles. Quite a few transport vehicles that people use to get places as well. So I could use my context clues here to maybe guess that commuter system's something about like public transport perhaps. And our last one are general clues or general kind of inexact clues. Now these are the ones where you are going to need to read the sentence quite carefully and use kind of the actions and the actions and the things happening in the sentence to help you figure out the word. So the verbs and the nouns. So our first example is he will also give you a signed memorandum to that effect. Okay, so this is something that gets signed. Okay, so I could guess that it's maybe some kind of piece of paper, some kind of form perhaps. And I don't need to know exactly what a memorandum here is to kind of keep going with my reading. That's probably enough to kind of get me over that hurdle. In the second example, filled with an intense despair, Katagiri screamed. I'm not quite sure what despair is, but you know, the character screaming gives me a clue that it's maybe something not particularly enjoyable. Maybe there's some kind of like suffering involved. Maybe he's afraid of something. And again, I don't need to settle on a precise meaning for that word. If I have a bit of an idea, a general understanding of it, that should give me enough to move on. It's only if that word keeps coming up that it's going to be something that I really want to jump to a dictionary and look up the exact meaning of it. So these are our 5 examples, and we're just going to have a look at a worked example here that's been taken from Murakami's story. And I'm just going to focus on the yellow bits really. So, I have no idea, Frog said. Nobody knows what Worm is thinking inside that murky head of his. Few have ever seen him. He's usually asleep. That's what he really likes to do, take long, long naps. He goes on sleeping for years, decades, in the warmth and darkness underground. His eyes, as you might imagine, have atrophied. His brain has turned to jelly as he sleeps. So, the word we've got here is atrophied. I have no clue what that means, but I'm going to look around the sentences and see if I can find some clues. We've got this kind of mention of murky head over here. He's asleep. He's been sleeping for a long time by the looks of it. For years, for decades, in the warmth and darkness underground. Okay, so if he's been sleeping for a long time, he's underground where there's not much light. His eyes haven't been used much, perhaps. His brain's turned to jelly as he sleeps, so he's got no, his brain's kind of switched off almost. So I'm thinking atrophied might be something about Worm, this character, not using his eyes. Maybe his eyes being damaged in some way, perhaps. If you ask me, I'm just going to skip down to this next part. So with all different kinds of hatred he has absorbed and stored inside himself over the years, his heart and body have swollen to gargantuan proportions, bigger than ever before. Okay, now this is a tricky one, because we've got quite a few unfamiliar words happening. But if he's taken something and stored it inside himself, he's absorbed it. Absorbing might be kind of about taking something inside. Okay, I know I've heard my mum talking about sponges absorbing stuff in the past. Okay, so it's that idea of maybe like soaking things up. His heart and body have swollen to gargantuan proportions, bigger than ever. Okay, now here's an example of that synonym clue. Okay, because he's mentioned bigger than ever before, and that's kind of giving us another way of understanding what's just come in front of it. Swollen to gargantuan proportions. So I'm guessing gargantuan proportions means they've gotten quite big, or the worm's gotten quite big. Yeah, his heart and his body. And they've swollen, the verb, well, I guess that's about them growing bigger perhaps. So his heart and body have grown to, big proportions, to a large size. Okay. So these are some of the ways that we can use kind of neighbouring words, neighbouring sentences to help us figure out words we don't know. And again, it's really important that you just get a general sense of the word. It's not crucial that you have an exact definition for every single word. That's not how really good readers read, because that's also how you kind of slow your reading down a lot by getting caught up on words. So go away, use that reading strategy when you approach your texts, and see how you go.